All right, this is Mike Benoit, and I guess you can't see me right now. That's okay. You see Larken Rose up there on the screen, and this is going to be a critique of his video. I guess he did about a year ago. What happened to 861 argument? Now he closed off the comments on that video, so you cannot see. There's no comments, and he says he's got some squirrely reason at the end of his video for why he's closing off the comments. It may be for some guys like me to can show that he's all full of wet, all full of wet. And that's a new term, full of wet, instead of all wet. And so we're going to play a little bit what he has to say here, and then we're going to say something.
And so they said, well, why do you bring it up at all then? I was hoping, the reason I brought it up at all, first of all, the reason I got into it is when I heard about it and looked into it, it looked like a puzzle to me. It looked like a riddle or a fraud that somebody didn't want everybody understanding, which is totally what it was. But when I found what I found and did my research and stuff, I was hoping that even the people who bow to government, even the people who believe in authority and all that garbage might care if they found out that they were being defrauded by their own government, even according to its own rules. Now, ultimately, it doesn't matter. Eventually, when humanity grows up and realizes there can't be such thing as a ruling class, we don't need to dig through all their gajillion pages of law book stupidity to understand that we own ourselves.
You know, that's real funny. When you all grow up out there and realize that, you know, you don't have to pay attention to those thugs, when everybody grows up and realizes, then all this IRS code and stuff, it ain't going to matter at all. We'll just have to wait for people to grow up, and they're going to figure all this out. And everything's going to be fine when people are all grown up. Now, I'm going to let him go a little bit longer here, but he goes on for about, well, I'm just going to go a little bit longer here and then cut him off, and then I'll talk about what he does for the next 16 minutes.
This won't matter. So in one sense, this is sort of trivial and irrelevant. But it is a massive fraud, and it's a provable fraud, and I was hoping that even statists would sort of care if they were being defrauded. Turns out they didn't. Trouble is, most people are really bad at analyzing evidence.
You know, and there's a comment that he was even hoping that even hoping that statists would care if they were being defrauded, and they don't. He said they didn't. Larken Rose, if they knew they were being defrauded, they would care. That you didn't show them that they were being defrauded. So don't tell me if somebody knows they're being defrauded, they won't care.
It's especially evidence which conflicts with what they already think they know, with their paradigms and their assumptions. And so in the tax honesty movement and outside it and everybody else, hardly anybody could objectively examine the actual issue.
Now, that's funny, and you know what? He's correct in that statement, but he's putting himself in the category of somebody that could objectively understand the statement, and he certainly is not that guy.
And I found that as soon as I, started looking into various theories in the tax honesty movement, a bunch of them totally don't hold water. There are people taking things out of context.
And his theory absolutely doesn't hold water. I'm going to show you in a little bit why it doesn't hold water.
Presumably by accident, but sometimes it seems like people make stuff up and lie about it on purpose. I can't always tell the difference. So there's a million theories out there that are bogus, and this just sounds like one more, so people categorize it in their head as, oh, this is some tax protester thing, right? And the time and effort it takes to actually understand it and look at the evidence, people just didn't want to take that time, which I can sort of sympathize with. I long for the day when people won't need to dig into the magical scribblings of politicians because they won't freaking matter. But the reason I don't talk about it is it matters to hardly anybody what the actual evidence is. And
okay, so he's going to go on for about 15 more minutes on that, and he's going to be talking basically why about some income is not taxable. Different kinds of income are not taxable. and he'll be talking about how, using his 861 argument, that the income tax doesn't apply to his income. And he'll make reference that some income is not taxable under the Constitution, and that he has that kind of income. And so that's basically his whole argument, which is an argument that says there is an income tax law, it just doesn't apply to me. And that's 180 degrees off course. And if you get yourself into the courtroom on that basis, he's already said there's an income tax law. He says this, but this tax law doesn't apply to him. And he's got his argument, and he presents his argument and why it doesn't apply to him. Now, if the argument loses, then the default is he is subject to this income tax law. And he misses some of the very basics here. Now, I wrote a book, Tyranny Busters, The Sham and Shame of the Federal Income Tax. And a couple of really heavy-duty quotes in there in the preface. And this is by Thomas Jefferson. You see, the income tax is a huge tyranny upon the mind of man. It's a matrix like you can't believe. And so, in a way, I forgive people that come up with these concepts that, like Larken Rose comes up with, and other folks like him, is because it's such an odious, insidious thing, this enslavement of mankind, that it can't be, and can't be at the same time in a country that's supposed to be a country based on, an inalienable right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So they come up with these things, and Thomas Jefferson spoke to this kind of concept, or a hostility against this kind of thing. And he says, I've sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. And I'm so impressed with that quote, because he's not talking about, locking you up, putting you in prison, and, controlling your body and controlling your actions. But he's talking about controlling your mind. And the only way someone can control somebody's mind is by deception, by a tyranny upon the mind, by a fraud. And there's numerous ways to do that. So that's what Jefferson's talking about when he speaks to a tyranny upon the mind of man. Now, the IRS and the government, when they got everybody duped into believing that their labor is owned by the government, and the government can tell them how much they can keep, there will be people like Larken Rose that find it, and of course, people like myself find it foul. But he comes up with what he considers a solution, and his solution is to say, well, there's an income tax, but it must apply to somebody else, not to me. And in that basic understanding, and I've seen a lot of folks that, like these different gurus in this tax movement. Some folks like, what's this guy's name? Pete something, Pete Hendricks or something like that. And then Larken Rose, he had a lot of followers, and Eddie Kahn and Lynn Meredith, and of course Irwin Schiff. And I got to give Irwin some kudos for some of his lien and levy package materials and some other things. And everybody kudos for resisting the tyranny in government. But all of these folks, I studied all of them, and then one day I bounced into Otto Skinner, his work. And he wrote 3 books, The Best Kept Secret, The Biggest Tax Loophole of All, and If You Are the Defendant. And what he came up with, it was like, finally, after studying all this other stuff, I could have locked into any one of these different theories and said, yeah, and ran with it, but something was just saying, you know what, there's something just not right with this. And I didn't give up my studies, so I studied Otto Skinner's stuff. And the most impressive thing to me is a statement he made early on in his books, I guess in the beginning. And he said, what is it that's actually being taxed? Is it people? Is it property? Or is it activities? There cannot be any intelligent conversation about a tax until the actual subject of the tax is known. Now, a lot of these tax gurus shun that idea and that concept. But if you think about it, we have that covers the gamut of human existence: property, the person themselves, and activities. So if you look at it, that's all that can be categorized as an area of possible taxation: property, people, or some activities. And if you don't have the answer to what is the subject of that tax, how could you move forward? And you say, well, why does it matter? Well, it matters because in the Constitution, it gives Congress absolute power to tax. Man, it's an amazing, really, what's the word? Ferocious power to tax. But there's a few limitations. And there's limitations on there's direct taxes and indirect taxes. And logic would just show that direct taxes are on people or property. If you're the subject of the tax, that's direct, that's right to you. Indirect taxes would be on activities. So they don't occur until the activity occurs. So, and those were listed in the Constitution as excises, imposts, duties, and those kinds of things. Direct taxes were taxes on people and property. And so the rules laid out for the two was on the indirect taxes, they had to be uniform. And on the direct taxes, they had to be apportioned. Now, Larken Rose does cover the ground where the 16th Amendment did not give Congress any new power. And so that was understood that's understood by almost everybody in the tax honesty movement. That's the case. So if that's the case, then prior to 1916, the amendment year, 1916, 1913, what was it, 1913? Prior to 1913, they couldn't tax somebody with an indirect tax unless it was uniform, and a direct tax unless it was apportioned. Now, the simple explanation of apportioned tax is you got to know how much you got to apportion out to the states according to their population. And so you got to know the amount of tax first. And again, direct taxes are on property, and so or people. So the 16th Amendment did not change that. Okay, so that's the same. So now Larken Rose in this video here, he goes in and he's talking 14 minutes or 15 minutes about the so-called income tax. And I use that term because that's Otto Skinner's term, so-called income tax. Now they're calling this thing a so-called income tax, but let's just say, well, I don't have a stack of money here right now, but let's say I did. Let's say this was a stack of money. Now that would be property, right? Now if you got income, right, somebody gave you some money and they called it income, then that's property, right? So if they tax that, then that would be a direct tax, right? But Larken Rose doesn't care about that. He's going on there as if this income tax thing exists. And back to Otto Skinner again, how can you have an intelligent conversation when you don't know the actual subject of the tax? Now, go look at the Internal Revenue Code, and I believe there's 100 and some taxes imposed in there. And you can see that they're all on activities. And you can also see in there who's made liable for the tax. Now, Larken Rose goes in and talks about how his income is not taxable. But he's making the argument that there is a tax imposed in the code on income. Now, is the word on referring to income as the subject, or is it referring to an activity, and income is the measure of the tax on income, regarding income? So this is the mind thing, and this is actually the protection I'm hoping it was the founders were wise enough, they knew this, and maybe they didn't explain it to us in the centuries to come because they just assumed people would know it, but that this would limit their ability to, say, enslave and turn people into serfs on the plantation if it was understood that the fruits of their labor were also property, and that you couldn't tax property unless it was a direct tax, and that meant, everybody's going to be feeling the bite, because there's you're not going to say half the people are subject to this tax and the other half aren't. That wouldn't go over too well, and you'd have to know what the amount of tax was prior to that. So first and foremost, you got to know, is the subject of the tax some activity, and income is the measure of the tax, or is the income actually the subject of the tax? Now, that would be the questions that I would like Larken Rose and his followers to ask the IRS, not these questions about 861, foreigners earning income, etc., etc. And also, I'd like to know the code section that actually imposed the tax. Now, Larken Rose, in his argument on 861, he talks about how the taxpayer determines, his taxable income, and then he goes off into his formula. Well, to be a taxpayer, as that term is defined in the Internal Revenue Code, you're someone that's subject to or liable to an Internal Revenue Code tax. So my first question is not only what's the subject of the tax, people, property, or activities, but my next question is, where have I been made liable for this tax? Now, you'll look in the Internal Revenue Code, and it's covered in my book, Tyranny Busters, but you'll look in there and you'll see that the distiller of alcoholic beverages is, first, the distillation of alcohol is the subject of the tax. That's an activity. And the distiller is made liable. And so those two things married together makes it clear the activity being taxed, the person liable. You get to the subject of the so-called income tax, and this is a problem where they had to kind of use a word of art on us and maybe just gradually put people into this tyranny at such a slow rate that they didn't realize what was going on. And now we also think that somehow the money we get for the labor we exchange is somehow a gain, as if our labor was worth nothing. That's a real tyranny upon the mind of man. But Larken Rose going on and saying the income tax exists, which is to say that it's a tax on property without apportionment, or is it to say, well, it's a tax on some activity, but we don't know what the activity is? And to go out there and argue that the tax exists, but I'm not subject to it, seems to me like you're going to be proving a negative. You have to prove a negative. And where I'd rather, say, okay, government, you say that there's an income tax and that people have to pay it. What's the subject of the tax? And if I can show them 114, and maybe if people would sit through a video like that, 114 different taxes showing what the actual activity of the tax is and who's liable, then and there people might say, you know what, there is no direct tax on property, income. That's property, right? Dollars of property. It would have to be on some activity, and of course, there's no objection, and it's in the Supreme Court cases, and I cover that in my book, Tyranny Busters. There's no objection to the fact of that the tax would be measured by, say, income. Say they imposed a tax on wagering. Actually, there is a tax on wagering in the Internal Revenue Code. And they measured the tax by the amount of gain or profit, income. There'd be no problem with that. It would be constitutional. It's a tax on a revenue taxable activity. They name the activity, and income is used as the measure of the tax. They're not using income as a subject of the tax. Thus, it would be a direct tax. Now, Larken Rose at 19 minutes in here, I'm going to see if I can get to that point of this tape. You know what I mean? Close enough. We'll hit right there.
For the liars and crooks they are, which I did. Would have been more fun to do that and get acquitted, but 12 complete imbeciles on the jury said, no, you didn't do as you told, you must be bad.
So he calls these people 12 complete imbeciles on the jury. He's trying to convince the people on the jury that there is an income tax law, but it doesn't apply to Larken Rose. And here's why it doesn't apply to Larken Rose. He uses an argument, and you want to call me an imbecile, fine, but he doesn't. He doesn't know this stuff. I know this stuff. And so he thinks he knows it. He went down one road and just swallowed it all up and just, when you try to talk to him and say, hey, wait a minute, what about this? No, he had to avoid that. But he calls these jurors imbeciles. Now, maybe you're the imbecile, Larken Rose, when you go into court and you get your jury trial, which the IRS stole my house, okay? I'm not saying the tyrants can't still do this stuff, but they stole my house without giving me a jury trial. They did something called a summary judgment, and they were able to just, say, okay, we, the judge, and the IRS have the power, and you lose because we don't think you have a disagreement, and we think you agree with the facts. They didn't let me get to the jury to decide the facts. Now, if I get to the jury to decide the facts, I'm going to be showing the jury how I've been communicating with the IRS all this time, asking for simple questions to be answered. Now, the jury would have probably looked at my case and said, well, look, they're trying to get $144,000 from this guy, and they got no record or any proof here of income. They just got some form they issued 10 years after the fact, and he's showing how these, he at least shows how these penalties don't apply, and the reason they wouldn't apply, and there's no record of any substitute for return. The government says they don't have them, and XYZ, they got no proof of income. Then, maybe the jury would find against me, but I certainly doubt it with all that information. They'd probably say, no, maybe you owe something, but not this much, so you take the guy's house. This is ridiculous. And so, but we can't call these people imbeciles because an imbecile tries to argue that a tax exists, but it doesn't apply to him, but it applies to those 12.
Never mind that I just showed them the direct citations of law showing that the judge doesn't know what he's talking about, the prosecutor doesn't know what he's talking about. All the IRS agents that I got on the stand admitted they couldn't explain it, hadn't seen that, couldn't answer my questions. They admitted this on the stand in front of the jury. No, we didn't rebut it. We didn't show them anything. We just said, I don't know, we'll get back to you. If that was good enough, we'll get back to you, was good enough for the jury to say, well, you must be guilty, because they said, we'll get back to you. And I want to add, and you can see this if you go, if you watch Theft by Deception, which is not a light watch. I mean, I made the thing. I can't watch it all the way through myself. It's very concentrated time.
Well, you know what? I can't watch any of this stuff either because it's way off base. I mean, this is a convoluted, complicated thing that is actually simple, like the wizard behind the clock. And to complicate it and say, let me find a reason why the tax doesn't, it's got to exist. Everybody's filing these things, and it must exist, so let me find something here that doesn't apply to me. Well, it's the Wizard of Oz. There is no tax imposed in the Internal Revenue Code on the remuneration you get for your labor. But, of course, this is my opinion, because I couldn't find it. And it's my opinion that's the way to go, is to say, where is this tax imposed? What's the subject of the tax? Where was I made liable for the tax? Do you realize that you're the one that told the IRS that you're subject to and liable for this tax when you filled out your first withholding form? And you're telling them, hey, yep, I'm subject and liable for this tax. So Larken Rose doesn't want to take any of that kind of responsibility. And today, I'm sure he's filing income tax returns because his master made him, and he's waiting for the rest of the world to stop paying, so he'll be free of it. This is some of your gurus here.
Of information and evidence to follow. If you do it in pieces. But it very clearly shows a huge pattern going on for 80-some years of them moving things around in the law to make it harder and harder to find that it says, here's what's taxable, and guess what? It's probably not you. And
here's what's taxable. See, he talks about definitions. Where is the tax imposed? And is it a tax on people, property, or activities? Now, the last thing, I'm not going to go into the last 7 minutes of this video. The last thing I'm going to say is this video has comments open, and even Larken Rose can comment on this. But his nonsense 861 argument, his nonsense that an income tax exists but it just doesn't apply to me, look over here, is to say, and without any discussion on whether or not it's a direct tax or indirect tax, is it a tax on persons, property, or some activity? Without even going down that road at all, you're in a dead-end street. You're trying to prove that something exists, but it doesn't apply to you.